Hi, I'm Pastor Dick Stadler, and we're here to talk about Exodus chapter 32 and the story of the golden calf. If you've got a chemist in the house, why don't you invite the chemist to sit in and watch this, because I've got something kind of special that I discovered that I'd like to have tested currently. I've tested it a number of times in the past myself, but we'll get to that, all right? If you've got a Bible, you might want to open it to Exodus 32 so you can follow your text along with the one that I'll be using. And maybe you can see some questions that you would like to fire my way that your translation brings out that mine does not. Okay? Now, let's get the background for Exodus 32. The children of Israel have been delivered from Egyptian slavery. They had seen lots of miracles by God. The miracle of the Passover and their houses being spared because there was the blood of a lamb on the doorpost. The miracle of their being saved at the Red Sea when the waters came together and drowned the army of Pharaoh. And they were delivered again when they were hungry and grumbling, and God gave them manna. It's kind of a bread-like material to eat every day, as well as quail meat every night. And then he also, one time when they were complaining at Meribah, he gave them miraculous water from a rock when Moses just hit the rock with his staff. So they have seen a number of miracles. They've experienced that God is taking care of them. And so it's going to be interesting to see their attitude in chapter 32. So what precedes chapter 32? In chapter 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai. God calls up Moses to talk to him. The people are scared to death. And so they say, you talk to God and then you report back, because we're terrified by the appearance of this mountain. It was shaking, it was thundering, there was lightning, there was fire at the top of the mountain. And so they were terrified. And so God does speak with Moses, and he gives him the 10 Commandments in chapter 20, verses 1 to 20. And then he does that in the hearing of the people, so the people can hear these things. And in Exodus 20, verses 22 to 23, the Lord says to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. So they heard his voice, they heard his commands. You shall not make gods of silver, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. So they can't claim ignorance about what they will eventually do in chapter 32 when they make a demand that Aaron make them some gods. What's interesting is that in chapter 24 of Exodus, twice it says that they say that they will do everything that they have heard. In verse 3 of chapter 24, it says, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And then in verse 7, they repeat that. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Then for the next 7 or 8 chapters, you have all of the commands that God gives to Moses about the tabernacle and its blueprint, about the priesthood and their garments, about how to celebrate all of the religious festivals, how to govern the people, and what the moral rules will be and what the punishments will be for people who misbehave. Now we get to chapter 32. And so in chapter 32 it begins by saying, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together. Some translate this, they gathered themselves against Aaron, and that could be the implication of this. And instead of asking him for anything, since he's their high priest, he's the brother of Moses, they make a demand. Up, make us gods who shall go before us. And when Stephen retells this story in Acts chapter 7, verse 40, before he's stoned to death, he says that they ask Aaron to make us gods to lead us. Who had been their leader up to this point? Well, Moses had. And now he's been up on Mount Sinai. And in chapter 24, we're told that he's up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. So we don't know where in the 40-day period this impatience is starting to set in. Maybe it's toward the end of the 40 days. And so what does Aaron do? Does he say, wrong? We agreed, and you said you agreed, that you would not make any gods of silver or of gold. No. He tells them, take off the rings of gold that are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters. So that tells us something incidentally, that it was a common practice for them to wear these gold earrings in their ears. Where did they get all that jewelry? Well, if you remember the story of the Exodus, the Egyptians were so glad after 10 plagues, and especially the death of the firstborn, to get rid of these slaves, that they gave them all kinds of jewelry and important things that they could take with them. And so that's probably where a lot of this came from. And so they were gold, and that's what Aaron uses now to fashion this golden calf. And it says that it was very intentional on his part. It uses the same word for fashioned that Moses uses in Genesis chapter 2 to describe how God fashioned and created Adam, and how he fashioned and created the animals out of the dirt. So this is not just some happenstance. And he does so, according to Exodus, with a graving tool. So that he had the equipment, and somehow he melted the gold down and formed it in the shape of a calf. Now, there were a lot of experiences that the Israelites may have seen going on in Egypt while they were slaves, of the Egyptians worshiping gods who were depicted as bulls. We don't know of any that were depicted as little bulls, as calves. And we don't know exactly why Aaron decided to make a calf instead of a bull. Maybe he just didn't have enough gold. But one commentator suggested, and I've got to verify this, and if you hear anything more, please send me an email, that there was a deity in Egypt that was invisible and rode over a bull or a calf. And so this may have been Aaron's accommodation, trying to sneak something in on the people who wanted him to make a false god out of gold or silver. And he was making a calf so that he could then use it to talk about, as a visual aid, the invisible God who had led them out of Egypt and so forth. But it doesn't do any good, because once he fashions the calf and then he creates an altar, the people say, aha, these are your gods, O Israel, who have led you out of Egypt. And so they give this one golden calf the credit for being many more than one God who led them out of Egypt. And so they've really insulted the true God who has done that and is meeting on Mount Sinai with Moses. And so they rose up the next day, and they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings to this altar in front of the golden calf. So not only are they insulting God by getting another God image, but they're also offering sacrifices not to the true God, which they had heard about as he gave them his law, but to a false god. And then the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That may be a euphemism for sexual practices connected with Egyptian worship life. And so they may have copied their oppressors now that they have a chance to carry out their freedom. And the Lord said to Moses, go down, your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them, and they have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So God heard it all. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. The word stiff-necked is hard of neck. It means stubborn. The GW translation says, impossible to deal with. And over a half a dozen times, that's how the children of Israel are described in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch. And therefore, God says to Moses, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation out of you. Now that is a great temptation for Moses. He has been called by God to be the leader for God's people, to be their mediator, their go-between. But now God is suggesting that he can just destroy all these people and raise up a whole new crop of people to be a mighty nation from Moses. But Moses remembers who he is. He remembers that he is the mediator God called him to be. And he implores God. He makes intercession for Israel. O Lord, why does your wrath burn against your people? He reminds them these are his people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians be able to say after they see you destroy them in the wilderness, after delivering them, that they are just being consumed, and raise all kinds of discredit on you, O God? Turn from your burning anger, he pleads, and relent from this disaster against your people. And then he reminds God of the promise God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, to your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, that I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sands of the sea, and I will give you the land I promised you. And so God is giving Moses a chance to prove that he is really an authentic prophet of the Lord. And Moses then speaks back to God what God has promised and said. And this has to please God, because God relents. It's the success of Moses' intercession. Then Moses turns and he goes down from the mountain, having pleaded for the forgiveness of the people. And Joshua, who has accompanied him, says there's a sound of war in the camp, of victory, some kind of celebration. And Moses says, no, it's not the sound for shouting for victory. It's the sound of a cry of cry of defeat. It's the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as they came near the camp and they saw the calf and they saw the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. He throws down the tablets and shatters them. He takes the calf and he burns it up, and he then grinds it into powder, scatters it in the water, and he makes the people drink it. Now here comes the surprise that I learned almost 40 years ago. A professor from Bethany Lutheran College, who was also a pastor down in Florida when I was a pastor in Tennessee, wrote an article in the Northwestern Lutheran in which he said that when Moses put the gold powder into the water, it turned the water red. It's a chemical reaction that occurs. Well, I didn't believe that. I thought that that was just a lot of imagination. But I checked it out with over half a dozen chemists, and there is that possibility. In fact, when you take small elements of gold, they call that colloidal gold. And when they take the colloidal gold, they can put it in water, and it has various degrees of red crimson, and it can, depending on how large the particles are, it can also be blue. But the smaller the particles, the more the chances are that the water is going to turn red. And if he has ground this into dust, ground it into powder, then there's a very good possibility that it was red, just as Professor Anderson had claimed. Now, the text doesn't say that, and so I realize this is speculation. We're dancing in the white fire, as I sometimes have learned from Jewish rabbis, when we're speculating on things that are not said in the text. But What a visual lesson that would be for the children of Israel. God is a great teacher, and he may have inspired Moses to this decision so that the people would have to drink this red water. And what would that remind them of? The very first miracle that Moses did to release them from slavery, turning the waters of the Nile into blood. But also, as they drank that red water, as they were thirsty, what would happen to it in their bodies? First of all, they'd be reminded that they're drinking their God. So what kind of a God is this that you can drink? But secondly, they would find that the next day when they had to go to the toilet, it would end up in the toilet. There's your God, Israel, that you think was going to lead you somewhere. This would be a powerful, powerful visual lesson for Israel, and a humbling one. So the question is, can dust-sized particles of gold mixed with water turn red? And I Googled this, and I've searched it now, and I've talked with half a dozen chemists. So if you have a chemist in the family who wants to send me an email and let me know whether there's some faults with that, or the water has to have certain properties before the colloidal gold pellets will turn to red, I'm open to that. I'm willing to learn. But if this is true, first of all, it tells us how smart God is and how smart his spokesman Moses may have been, what great teachers they were, and how they were willing to use visual lessons in order to reinforce their message to God's people. Well, now let's finish this story, okay? Have you asked yourself the question, if Aaron was supposed to be the priest, and he was supposed to guide people morally, why doesn't he ever get punished? He's the one who crafted that golden idol. Well, God is angry at Aaron. And we're told in this same chapter that Moses intercedes for him too. Not only does he intercede for the children of Israel, he intercedes for Aaron. And Aaron is then forgiven by God. But on the way to getting to that point, Moses asks Aaron very specifically, why did you do this? And Aaron says, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. This is now in verse 22. You know this people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses guy, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. Now all Aaron had to say was, you agreed to follow the commands of God, and that means we're not going to make an idol. But he caves into them. And he may have thought that he could somehow use this golden calf to redirect people's attention to the true God. But it doesn't work. And they commit terrible idolatry, a terrible sin against God. And so when he explains this to Moses, his explanation is unbelievable. He says, so I said to them, let any who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Poof! Magic! This clearly contradicts what the text tells us in chapter 32, verse 4, when it says that Aaron fashioned the way a potter fashions a vessel, this gold calf. So he can't use that as an excuse. He's without excuse. But Moses intercedes for him and achieves forgiveness for him. And now comes the consequences and the punishment. And Moses stands up and says, anybody who is on the Lord's side, not this false god, on the Lord's side. And he uses the name that God had given to him in Exodus chapter 3. Yahweh. I will have everybody gather to me who's going to be faithful to this God. And all the Levites, that's the tribe from which he comes, they gather around him. And now he gives them a terribly painful command. He says, I want you to go through the whole company of Israel and kill even your brothers and anybody else, your neighbor, your friend, who has committed this terrible idolatry. And they do. And 3,000 people are punished and killed. Now, if you'd like to read a parallel account of this whole episode, Moses also records it in Deuteronomy chapter 9, from verses 6 to 21. And toward the end of that retelling of the story, now that the children of Israel have finished their 40-year wandering in the wilderness, they're on the shore of the Jordan River, they're about to go across under Joshua's leadership while Moses is left to die and be buried on Mount Nebo. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 9, here's what it says about Aaron. And the Lord was so angry with Aaron, this is verse 20 of Deuteronomy 9, that he was ready to destroy him. And Moses, now speaking in the first person about what he did, says, and I prayed for Aaron also at that time. Then I took the sinful thing, the calf that you had made, and burned it with fire and crushed it, grinding it very small until it was as fine as dust. And I threw the dust of it into the brook that ran down from the mountain. So apparently the water supply that is described in Exodus 32 was a river that was coming down the mountain. Now, what is the consequence of the people's rebellion? Not only were 3,000 killed, but Moses says to the people, you have sinned a great sin, and now I'm going to go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for you. So he just doesn't stop being the man that God has called him to be. So Moses returns to the Lord, and he says, this people has committed a great sin. They made for themselves gods of gold, and now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. So he's willing to sacrifice himself for his people, for God's people. That sounds very similar, doesn't it, to what Paul writes about in Romans when he says, if I could be condemned so that my people would be saved, I would do that. That's how sacrificial his love is for his people, that he's willing to say that. But now, God says to him, you go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you, the promised land. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. And the Lord sent a plague on the people, because they had made the calf, the one that Aaron had made. So that's the story. And if you have anything that you want to ask further questions about or offer insights, fire away. As we look at this story, we not only have to know the what, Scripture says, but also the so what. Can we grow impatient with God, not appearing in our lives the way we want Him to, or answering our prayers the way we want Him to? And can we turn to other gods? Now that may seem like an impossibility for a lot of Christians, that they would ever commit idolatry. But if you use Luther's explanation of what idolatry is, he says, anything you live for has become your God. That puts it in a different category, doesn't it? It is possible for us to make idols out of our job, out of a pastime, a career, our children, or someone we love, and to live for them, sacrifice for them, and not keep God at the center of our lives, and treat all of these others as gifts from God, on loan to us. That's one possibility, right? How about the second question, the so what? Have we done for others who have sinned seriously what Moses has done for Aaron and for the people of Israel? Have we remembered to intercede for them, to intervene, to pray for their forgiveness, to pray for their conversion? We don't have to bargain with God to go with us. because God has promised us irrevocably that we never go alone as children of God. He says in Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He says also in Matthew 28:20, Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. So, as we remember those things, may God also strengthen us in our faith and equip us to not only serve Him, but also serve others. Now, if you did find something new in this, can you please click the like button? That'll tell me that you've discovered something new, just like I discovered something new 40 years ago. Okay? Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, just push that little subscribe button and you'll get notifications when the next videos are coming out. All right? God bless you and have a good rest of the day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and God be with you.